At dawn, the airstrips at Dobadura and Port Moores became alive. Mechanics worked by flashlight, loading ammunition belts and checking the synchronization of the 8.50 caliber guns. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with mud and sweat. Pilots scribbled coordinates on their kneeboards, routes to the northern coast, to Madang, Wewak, and Bagajim, where intelligence showed steady movement of trucks and barges resupplying Japanese garrisons. The mission orders were simple but deadly: fly low, stay fast, and don't come back with ammunition. The Havocs would cross the Owen Stanleys in pairs or trios, no higher than 500 feet once over enemy territory. Altitude was safe, but speed was survival. Captain Edward Larner led the first wave that morning. His wingman, Lieutenant Donald Coutts, flew close enough that their wingtips seemed to breathe in rhythm. The twin Wright R-2600 engines howled as the aircraft climbed into the mountain mist. Frost gathered on the inside of the cockpit glass, visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. "You could hear the peaks before you saw them," Coutts later said. The wind made the rocks sing. Breaking through the clouds, the Havocs leveled out into blinding sunlight, and then, suddenly, the world dropped away. The northern slopes fell sharply to the sea, revealing jungle valleys threaded with silver rivers. Below them, Japanese supply routes gleamed like scars through the trees. The pilots dove. Their first target was a column of trucks moving along the Wewak-Maprick Road. At treetop height, Larner lined up his gun sight on the lead vehicle, a flatbed loaded with drums of aviation fuel. When he fired, the 8 Brownings lit up the jungle in a single blinding streak. The explosion threw debris hundreds of feet into the air. The Havoc's belly skimmed the smoke as it pulled away, the smell of burning rubber and cordite filling the cockpit. Each run lasted mere seconds, but the effect was devastating. By the time the second pair of Havocs arrived, the entire road was blocked by wreckage. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews tried to respond, but their guns, designed for high-altitude bombers, were useless against aircraft that came in below the treeline. When the Americans turned for home, the column no longer existed. Intelligence officers later counted over 50 destroyed vehicles from aerial photos. The mission's total flight time was less than an hour. Back at Dobadura, the ground crews cheered the returning aircraft. Mechanics counted the bullet holes in the wings and fuselage. One Havoc came back with branches still lodged in its nose. Yet every pilot made it home. They had flown through weather, mountains, and flak, and turned an entire convoy into ash. Word spread quickly through 5th Air Force headquarters. General George C. Kenney, commanding the theater's air operations, immediately ordered more Havocs to be converted into the new gunship configuration. "This is the answer to New Guinea's roads," he wrote in his diary that night. The Japanese, meanwhile, began to call the A-20s Jungle Thunder. Their own reports described the attacks as unpredictable and annihilating. Infantrymen along the coast were told to dig deeper and move only at night. But even then, the engines still found them. By April, the roar of those twin engines over the Owen Stanleys had become the soundtrack of defeat, a sound the jungle itself learned to fear. The Wewak-Maprick Road had once been a triumph of Japanese engineering, a narrow but vital artery carved through the jungle by hand, connecting the coastal base at Wewak to the interior supply hubs. By mid-1943, it had become something else entirely, a killing ground. Every curve of the road bore the scars of strafing runs, every bridge a memory of fire. The Americans called it the Black Road, after the burned wrecks that lined it for miles. Intelligence photographs showed endless processions of vehicles, trucks loaded with ammunition, gasoline, food, and men, creeping through the forest. The Japanese 4th Air Group tried to escort them with Ki-43 Oscars, but the A-20 Havocs were simply too fast and too low. "They come under our bellies," one Japanese pilot recalled during post-war interrogation. "We turn, and they are gone." For the men of the 89th and 90th Squadrons, those supply lines became a daily target. Every mission was the same: fuel, brief, take off, climb the Owen Stanleys, and dive into hell. The Havocs came in pairs, sometimes threes, sometimes entire squadrons when weather allowed. They struck not from altitude, but from the shadows. On April 11, 1943, the 3rd Bomb Group launched its largest low-level strike to date, 12 A-20s led by Major Raymond Wilkins, a veteran known for his precision flying. Their target was a 60-vehicle convoy reported moving from Maprick toward the coast. The formation hugged the terrain, never rising above 200 feet. Pilots flew by visual landmarks, a bend in the river, a cluster of palms, the glint of metal on the road. When they found the column, it was mid-morning. The sun reflected off truck roofs and gasoline drums, a glimmer that sealed the convoy's fate. Wilkins signaled with a quick dip of the wings and dropped into a shallow dive. His 8.50s opened fire, a thunderous growl that merged into one continuous roar. The first 10 seconds erased the lead trucks. The second pass ignited the rear. When the rest of the Havocs arrived, the road was already a corridor of flame. Bullets tore through men and metal alike. The ammunition trucks went up next, brilliant white flashes that shook the canopy. From above, AP-38 Lightning on reconnaissance captured the entire scene in motion pictures, lines of tracer fire cutting through green jungle, explosions rolling like waves, and then silence. When the smoke cleared, only a handful of vehicles remained intact. Wilkins' aircraft, Hell's Wasp, returned with its nose paint scorched black from the heat of the burning convoy. His debriefing was simple: no return fire after second run. Road impassable. In late 1942, New Guinea was less a battlefield and more a nightmare carved into the tropics. The jungles along the Owen Stanley Range dripped with heat, disease, and silence broken only by the drone of engines and the rustle of unseen movement. It was here, in this half-forgotten corner of the Pacific, that the U.S. 5th Air Force forged one of its most brutal and effective weapons, the modified Douglas A-20 Havoc. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Originally designed as a light bomber for Europe, the A-20 had been considered too small, too limited, and too lightly armed for the high-altitude wars the Army Air Forces envisioned. But in the Pacific, altitude meant nothing. Wars here were fought between the treetops and the surf. At low level, the Havoc became something entirely new, a fast, snarling machine built to rip apart Japanese columns before they ever reached the front lines. At Port Moresby, mechanics of the 3rd Bomb Group, men who slept in tents and worked under monsoon rain, began turning the aircraft into something the manuals never described. They stripped out the bombardier's glass nose, replaced it with solid aluminum, and mounted 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns in the nose. Each gun could fire 800 rounds a minute. Together, they produced a torrent of lead so dense that pilots said it cut through trucks like paper. The Japanese, pressing south from La and Salamaua, relied on narrow jungle tracks and coastal roads to feed their garrisons. Long convoys of fuel trucks, supply lorries, and troop carriers crept forward under the canopy, believing themselves hidden from view. But American reconnaissance had mapped every route. Once the Havocs went operational, the jungle shadows became their hunting grounds. On January 15, 1943, the first of the new A-20GS, flown by Captain Edward Larner of the 89th Squadron, crossed the Owen Stanleys at dawn. The air was thin and clear, the sun rising behind him. Below, on the coastal road east of Wewak, stretched a Japanese column, 40 vehicles, including ammunition trucks and a line of infantry transports. Larner pushed the throttles forward. His wingmen tucked in close, just above the treetops. At 300 miles per hour, the Havoc roared into the column from behind. The nose guns opened, a solid, unbroken blaze of orange fire. Bullets tore through canvas roofs and fuel drums, igniting a chain of explosions that ran the length of the road. The Japanese defenders barely had time to return fire before the second aircraft struck. When the 2 A-20s pulled away, half the convoy was burning. The rest had scattered into the trees. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds. From that day forward, the A-20 was no longer seen as a stopgap. It was a terror weapon. Field intelligence reports noted that Japanese units along the coast began abandoning daylight movement altogether. "Twin engines are dead," one captured diary read. "They come low, they strike once, and nothing survives. At Port Moresby, the ground crews painted names on the Havocs' noses: Hell's Wasp, Burma Bound, Jackpot Judy. Crews swapped stories of what the 8 guns could do. Some claimed they could slice through coconut trees, others said the recoil made the aircraft lurch backward mid-flight. What mattered was results, and those came fast. In February alone, A-20s destroyed over 100 vehicles, fuel dumps, and gun positions along the Huon Gulf. The men flying them were mostly in their early 20s, brash, sleep-deprived, and fearless. When asked about their missions in post-war interviews, one pilot simply said, "We didn't bomb them. We erased them." By March, the A-20 Havoc had earned a new reputation among Allied units: the Jungle Reaper. Its role in New Guinea was just beginning, but the lesson was already clear: wars in the Pacific would be decided not by altitude or tonnage, but by speed, precision, and the relentless roar of 8.50 caliber guns. By March 1943, the Owen Stanley Mountains had become both a barrier and a proving ground. Rising to over 13,000 feet, they divided the northern and southern coasts of New Guinea, a line of rain-drenched peaks that swallowed aircraft whole. For pilots of the 3rd Bomb Group, flying an A-20 Havoc over those ridges was a test of nerve and machinery. The clouds were thick as wool, and navigation relied on instinct as much as instruments. But beyond those peaks lay the lifelines of the Japanese army, and the Americans were determined to sever them. The Japanese High Command was stunned. Reports from the 20th Division described supply losses so catastrophic that units in the Wewak area began to ration bullets. "We no longer fight the Americans," one officer wrote. "We fight their engines." General Kenny, reading the after-action reports at 5th Air Force Headquarters, immediately saw the strategic potential. The A-20s had done more than destroy vehicles, they had choked the enemy's logistics at the source. With no fuel or ammunition reaching Wewak, Japanese airfields were forced to ground dozens of aircraft. Pilots trained for interception now labored as guards, defending convoys that no longer existed. For the men of the 3rd Bomb Group, success came at a cost. The constant low-level flying shredded nerves and engines alike. Jungle humidity corroded guns and jammed triggers. Birds and debris struck propellers. Yet morale soared. The A-20 pilots knew they were rewriting the rules of air warfare, trading altitude for aggression, precision for destruction. In one post-mission photo, ground crews posed beside a wrecked Japanese truck convoy, the A-20 Burma Bound flying low overhead. Someone had scrawled on a signboard near the burned road, "Welcome to the Black Road, no round trips." It became an unofficial motto of the 3rd Bomb Group. By May 1943, that blackened stretch of road no longer served Japan's war effort. It served only as a graveyard, for trucks, for men, and for the illusion that the jungle could hide them from the thunder that came screaming out of the sky. By mid-1943, the A-20 Havoc had evolved from a stopgap bomber into a doctrine, a new way of fighting that the 5th Air Force spread across the Southwest Pacific. It wasn't written in manuals or taught in classrooms. It was carved from combat, shaped by necessity, and proven in the smoke that rose over Wewak, Salamaua, and Madang. At Dobadura, where red mud stuck to everything, the airmen of the 3rd Bomb Group built their own version of an air war. The Havoc, with its blunt nose and twin engines, became the centerpiece of a broader idea: strike before the enemy knows he's being hunted. It wasn't about bombing cities or airfields from high altitude, it was about annihilating logistics, the arteries of the Japanese army. The process was mechanical and human all at once. Mechanics worked through the night to reinforce gun mounts and replace barrels worn out from constant firing. Each aircraft carried nearly 3,000 rounds in its nose, the feed belts curling like steel serpents through the fuselage. Pilots discussed attack patterns over tin cups of coffee: which approach angle gave the tightest spread, which speed reduced recoil drift, which type of ammunition, armor-piercing or incendiary, produced more chaos when it struck a convoy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Havoc Doctrine, as it came to be called by late 1943, rested on 3 principles: speed, surprise, and sustained fire. A Havoc strike began long before takeoff. Reconnaissance photos were pored over by hand, tracing every possible escape route and identifying the most likely choke points, bridges, fords, or clearings in the trees. The pilots flew not in tight formations but in loose attack pairs, one drawing fire while the other strafed from the flank. They came in under radar, below treetop level, where every second meant the difference between life and death. Captain Donald Coutts later explained it bluntly: at 1,000 feet, you bomb. At 500, you strafe. At 50, you kill. By August 1943, the doctrine was tested again over the Markham Valley, where Japanese truck convoys attempted to reinforce La. Weather was atrocious: torrential rain, low visibility, and mountain turbulence. The Havocs went anyway. The lead aircraft, Burma-bound, tore through the mist at 270 miles per hour, its 8 guns spitting fire in rhythmic bursts. The convoy below disintegrated. 2 more waves followed, each one lower than the last, their engines echoing between the cliffs. After the attack, reconnaissance pilots reported an entire battalion's worth of supplies destroyed, over 100 trucks and several fuel depots. The Japanese never again attempted large-scale daylight movements through the valley. The result stunned even General George C. Kenney, who noted in his diary that the A-20 has become a one-pass annihilator. He ordered the doctrine standardized across all light bomber groups in the 5th Air Force. Crews from the 22nd and 417th Bomb Groups soon adopted the modifications: solid noses, 8 guns, low-level tactics, and the use of forward-deployed jungle airstrips to reduce flight time to target. The Japanese, reeling, adjusted too. Camouflage increased. Roads were covered with palm fronds. Truck columns were broken into smaller units that moved at night. But the Havoc pilots adapted just as quickly. They began launching at dawn, the gray hour, when shadows were longest and engines hardest to hear. By the time a convoy realized it had been spotted, it was already erased. Captured diaries later described the psychological impact: we fear the sound of 2 engines more than bombs. The twin hum means death. By late 1943, the Havoc doctrine had transformed New Guinea's air war. The jungle was no longer a shield. It was a trap. Every movement, every convoy, every shimmer of sunlight on metal was an invitation for attack. In less than a year, the A-20 Havoc had reshaped the Pacific battlefield, not through numbers or size, but through an idea that precision, aggression, and speed could dismantle an empire one burning road at a time. By the summer of 1943, Wewak had become the heart of the Japanese air presence in New Guinea. Its airfields, Wewak, Borum, Dagwa, and Butt, stretched along the coast like a chain of fangs, each guarded by anti-aircraft batteries, radar outposts, and dispersal revetments carved into the palms. From these bases, Japan launched raids against Allied positions at Dobadura, Oro Bay, and La. But by August, the tide had turned. The A-20 Havoc, backed by the relentless precision of the 3rd Bomb Group, was about to turn Wewak's might into cinders. For months, Allied reconnaissance had photographed Wewak's airstrips from high altitude. Analysts counted over 200 Japanese aircraft, including Zero fighters, Betty bombers, and Ki-43 Oscars, parked wingtip to wingtip in a display of overconfidence. General George C. Kenney saw an opportunity for destruction unlike anything yet attempted in the Southwest Pacific. "We'll catch them on the ground," he told his staff. "And we'll burn Wewak to the roots." At dawn on August 17, 1943, the plan went into motion. The first wave, heavy B-25 Mitchells from the 38th Bomb Group, hammered the anti-aircraft batteries and fuel depots. The second wave, made up of the newly modified A-20 Havocs of the 3rd Bomb Group, swept in from the east at less than 200 feet. Their mission: strafe everything that moved. Captain Edward Larner led the 89th Squadron's element. As the Havocs crossed the shoreline, the pilots could see entire rows of aircraft lined up on Borum Airfield. The Japanese gunners, dazed from the earlier bombing, opened fire too late. Larner dove in, his guns blazing. The 8 Brownings turned a row of parked Zeros into wreckage in seconds. A fuel truck exploded beside the runway, sending a rolling fireball across the tarmac. The blast nearly flipped Larner's aircraft. His gunners screamed into the intercom, "That's it, she's going up." Within moments, the entire airfield was a chain reaction. The Havocs strafed from one end to the other, leaving behind a black river of flame. A second element, led by Major Raymond Wilkins, attacked the Borum dispersal area, where more than 30 bombers sat exposed. Their .50 caliber guns cut through wings and fuselages as if they were paper. One Havoc, hit by ground fire, crashed beside the main runway, killing both crewmen instantly, but the rest pressed the attack. By the time the third wave, consisting of P-38 Lightnings, arrived to sweep the sky, there was nothing left to defend. Wewak burned for hours. The smoke rose 10,000 feet, visible all the way to La. When reconnaissance aircraft flew over the next morning, the devastation was beyond expectation. 170 Japanese planes destroyed on the ground, dozens of fuel dumps still smoldering, and the runways cratered and useless. The Japanese Fourth Air Army, effectively decapitated, lost nearly half its operational strength in a single day. But General Kinney wasn't done. On August 18, he ordered a follow-up raid, this time with Havocs leading the way. Flying at treetop level, they targeted surviving aircraft, warehouses, and even vehicles attempting to salvage parts from the wreckage. Gun camera footage from the mission shows trucks bursting apart under streams of tracers, aircraft being shredded where they sat, and mechanics fleeing through firestorms. By August 20, Wewak was finished. Allied pilots called it the Inferno. Japanese survivors later wrote that the air smelled of burning rubber and death for weeks. One diary, recovered by Australian troops months later, contained a single line, "The Americans struck with the power of the gods." The success at Wewak marked the high point of the A-20 Havoc's war in New Guinea. The mission became a textbook example of air-ground coordination, low-level precision, and relentless follow-through. It crippled Japan's ability to project air power in the region, and ensured that from then on, the only engines roaring over Wewak belonged to the United States. The 3rd Bomb Group returned to base battered but triumphant. As mechanics counted bullet holes and crews gathered for their nightly whiskey ration, one pilot looked out toward the mountains and said quietly, "Wewak burned today. The jungle won't forget." And neither would history. By late August 1943, the destruction of Wewak had crippled Japan's ability to control the skies over northern New Guinea. Yet even as the flames died down, the fight on the ground intensified. The Japanese army, desperate to reinforce its collapsing front near La and Salamaua, pushed whatever men and material it could through the inland trails and coastal roads. What remained of its supply network now ran through a single, vital corridor, the Hansa-Bogajam Road. To the Americans, it would soon be known as the Road of Fire. Reconnaissance from the 8th Photographic Squadron revealed the new route within days of Wewak's destruction. Long lines of trucks, horse carts, and fuel tankers snaked through the jungle in an attempt to bypass the wrecked airfields. General George C. Kinney immediately saw an opportunity to finish what the Havocs had begun. If Wewak was the head, he wrote in his diary, "This road is the spine. Break it, and the body dies." The 3rd Bomb Group was ordered to strike without pause. Every operational A-20 Havoc, nearly 40 aircraft, was armed to the limit. Mechanics at Dobadura and Nadzab worked through monsoon rain, replacing barrels, tightening mounts, and topping off fuel with hand pumps. The smell of gasoline mixed with mud and sweat. Crews slept beside their planes. On September 2, 1943, the first wave lifted off before dawn. The lead pilot, Major Raymond Wilkins, flew Burma bound, the squadron's most battle-worn Havoc. Behind him, a dozen more roared into formation, each loaded with 8 nose guns and 4 500-pound bombs. Their flight path cut directly across the Owen Stanleys, through clouds so thick the instruments spun erratically. One pilot later described it as flying inside a waterfall made of glass. They broke through the fog near Hansa Bay, and saw the road below glinting through the trees like a dark scar. Convoys moved in single file, trucks tarped with bamboo and palm leaves. But the camouflage fooled no one. Wilkins tipped his wings, signaling the attack. The Havocs dropped from 800 feet to barely 100, their engines howling. The first salvo came from Wilkins' guns, 8 streams of fire converging on a line of fuel trucks. The explosion that followed was so massive it threw his aircraft upward like a toy. The shockwave hit the others seconds later, igniting secondary fires that raced through the jungle. The road became an inferno, every flame feeding on the next. Second Lieutenant Paul Kinsley, flying off Wilkins' right wing, remembered the sound. It wasn't bombing. It was tearing. The guns just tore the road apart. Each Havoc made 2, sometimes 3 passes, strafing anything that moved. Some dropped their bombs on bridges and culverts to block retreating vehicles. The Japanese defenders fired wildly into the trees, but at such low altitude, their aim was futile. By the time the last A-20 pulled away, the road for 5 miles was a continuous belt of flame. Photographs taken that afternoon show smoke rising thousands of feet, visible even from Allied ships off the coast. That night, debriefings confirmed the scale of destruction, over 120 vehicles destroyed, including ammunition trucks, troop carriers, and supply wagons. The Japanese 51st Division, already starving for fuel and munitions, reported complete severance of the supply route in its war diary. The Allied intercept teams at Townsville translated the radio traffic, convoys annihilated. Request new vehicles. No replacements available. For the Havoc crews, it was their defining mission. They had perfected the art of precision at impossible speed. Pilots returned to base with hands blistered from vibration and eyes bloodshot from strain. But none were lost. When Wilkins landed, ground crews found fragments of Japanese helmets embedded in the leading edge of his wing. In the following days, the Japanese abandoned the Hansa-Bogajim corridor entirely. Jungle vines soon reclaimed the charred wreckage, but from above, the trail remained visible, a black ribbon through the green, scarred forever by the passage of the A-20s. The men who flew those missions didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as mechanics of destruction, engineers of survival. Yet in the quiet after each flight, when the engines cooled and the guns stopped smoking, they understood what they'd done. The road of fire had ended Japan's dream of holding New Guinea. And it had proven, beyond doubt, that in the Pacific, domination did not belong to the biggest bombers or the highest flyers, but to the men who fought at 50 feet, with 8 guns blazing and no margin for error. By the end of September 1943, the air over New Guinea belonged entirely to the Allies. The once dreaded Japanese Zero was now a ghost on the horizon, its presence reduced to fleeting, desperate sorties. The jungle airstrips that had once fed Japan's advance were silent, blackened scars on a green island. The men of the 3rd Bomb Group had done more than win battles. They had rewritten the nature of aerial warfare. The A-20 Havoc, the stubby twin-engine workhorse born from compromise, had become a legend whispered between mountains. The campaign that began with improvised conversions and hand-welded gun mounts had evolved into a symphony of precision. Every pilot, every mechanic, every ground controller now spoke the same language: speed, altitude, direction, strike. From La to Madang, from Wewak to Hansa Bay, the sound of twin engines had become synonymous with annihilation. The Japanese called it Raime no Oni, demons of thunder. Survivors of convoys told of A-20s materializing from mist and smoke, their guns roaring like gods of war. There was no time to pray, one Japanese sergeant confessed during post-war interrogation. We heard them, and then we died. For the crews, the missions blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion. Days began before sunrise and ended under the crimson glow of oil drums burning at dusk. Mud caked their boots, malaria sapped their strength, and sleep came only in brief, fevered bursts. Yet morale was unshakable. They could see the results of their work: the empty skies, the halted convoys, the surrendering garrisons. On October 3, 1943, General George C. Kenney visited the forward base at Dobadura. The men assembled under a tin awning streaked with rust, the air thick with humidity and the scent of engine oil. Kenney shook hands with pilots whose names he already knew from daily reports: Larner, Wilkins, Couts. "You boys," he told them, "turn the A-20 into the deadliest plane in the Pacific. "You've done more damage to Japan's army than they'll ever admit." Behind his words lay the truth of statistics. In less than 9 months of operations, the Havocs of the 3rd Bomb Group had destroyed or disabled more than 1,200 vehicles, dozens of bridges, and hundreds of tons of supplies. They had flown over 1,600 combat sorties with losses lower than 5%, a testament to both skill and innovation. The post-war analyses would later confirm what the pilots already knew: the A-20's impact went far beyond New Guinea. Its success shaped tactical doctrine for generations. The concept of low-level precision attack, using speed, concentrated firepower, and surgical timing, would later influence aircraft like the A-26 Invader, the B-57 Canberra, and even the A-10 Thunderbolt of a different century. But in 1943, none of that mattered to the young men who flew those missions. They were living hour to hour, mission to mission. Many never realized how profoundly they were changing the future of air combat. Captain Donald Coutts, after his final sortie over Madang, stood by his aircraft as ground crews refueled it one last time. "She's earned her rest," he said softly, running a hand along the scorched metal of the nose. The plane, patched and pitted from dozens of missions, bore faint traces of its name beneath soot and oil: Hell's Wasp. A photographer from the 5th Air Force captured the moment: a weary pilot, a battered plane, and a setting sun bleeding through the jungle haze. That photograph would later hang in the National Air and Space Museum, captioned simply, "The Sound of Victory." In the years that followed, when historians pieced together the war in the Pacific, they often spoke of great carriers and famous bombers. But in the jungles of New Guinea, victory had come on the wings of something smaller, faster, meaner, and infinitely more personal. For those who flew her, the A-20 wasn't just a machine. She was the thunder that broke Japan's hold on the island, the steel storm that erased the enemy's roads and convoys in one pass. And long after the war ended, when the veterans met in dim halls and shared whiskey under fading banners, they would raise a toast to that sound still echoing in their memories: the twin-engine growl that once ruled the skies. The Havoc. The Jungle Reaper. The thunder that never missed. When the guns finally fell silent across the Pacific, the jungles of New Guinea began to reclaim the scars of war. Rusted hulks of Japanese trucks lay swallowed by vines. Crumpled bridges sagged into riverbeds, their steel frames twisted and scorched. And scattered across forgotten airstrips, the remains of the A-20 Havoc, some wrecked, others simply abandoned, rested in quiet tribute to a war that had pushed both man and machine to their limits. For the men of the 3rd Bomb Group, the end came not with parades or speeches but with a strange emptiness. They had spent 2 years living in constant tension, building, flying, and fighting under conditions that tested human endurance. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, most were too exhausted to celebrate. Some wept quietly. Others just stared at the sky, half expecting to hear the familiar rumble of engines over the Owen Stanleys. Yet history would not forget them. The missions that began as desperate improvisations had evolved into a model of precision low-level warfare. Military analysts studying post-war records noted how the A-20's 8.50 caliber guns, concentrated in a solid nose, had revolutionized the concept of air-to-ground attack. It wasn't just about firepower, it was about accuracy, timing, and the courage to fly within yards of the treetops. General George Kenney himself called it a new kind of air war. He wrote in his memoirs that the Havoc squadrons didn't just bomb, they carved the enemy out of existence. Every bridge, every convoy, every column of Japanese trucks erased in one pass weakened Japan's ability to fight. Without those strikes, the costly ground campaigns that followed might have dragged on for months longer. By 1944, newer aircraft like the Douglas A-26 Invader began to replace the aging Havocs. Faster, longer-ranged, and deadlier, the Invader carried forward the same doctrine the A-20 had proven in blood and smoke. But the men who had flown the Havoc never forgot her quirks: the kick of her guns, the roar of her twin right engines, the way she shuddered when the bomb bay doors slammed open. In the decades that followed, historians tried to capture what the A-20 represented. Some called it the working man's bomber, others the fighter bomber that saved the Southwest Pacific. But among veterans, it was remembered more simply as the plane that never failed them. At reunions in the 1960s and 70s, graying pilots gathered under banners marked 3rd Attack Group, Grim Reapers. They would trade stories over whiskey and laughter, each one tinged with the ache of memory. They spoke of Wilkins, who earned the Medal of Honor but never lived to receive it. They spoke of Larner and Kautz, who flew their final missions and walked away from burning aircraft. They spoke of the mechanics, the armorers, the radio men, each a cog in a machine that had shaped the outcome of a war. In 1985, during a Pacific Theater veterans reunion in Hawaii, a restored A-20 Havoc made a ceremonial flyover. As its twin engines thundered across the airfield, old men rose from their seats and saluted through tears. For a moment, time folded back on itself, the humid air, the scent of oil, the sound that once meant survival. That day, one veteran was overheard saying quietly, "That sound is the jungle's heartbeat. It's how we knew we were still alive." Today, a handful of A-20s survive in museums across the world, static reminders of a time when speed and precision changed the face of air combat. Visitors pause before their sleek fuselages, reading placards that list missions, victories, and statistics. But numbers cannot tell what it meant to fly through smoke and tracer fire at 50 feet, or to see a Japanese convoy vanish in a single strafing pass. The true legacy of the A-20 Havoc lies not in medal or records, but in the men who turned an ordinary aircraft into an instrument of victory. They proved that courage and ingenuity could make any weapon unstoppable. And though the jungle has long since swallowed the wrecks, the echo of their engines still lingers in history's skies, fading, yet eternal. The Havocs came fast. They came low. And when they struck, Japan's columns vanished in one pass.